It's time to continue, and it's going to be great, tremendous. Interestingly, this next speaker's surname can be translated as God, so you know in advance not to expect too much. Jesper Boeg joins us on Epic. In addition to a great Agile, Scrum, and Kanban experience, he is an expert in applying Toyota Kata. The lecture is called The Art of Refinement. Agility starts upstream. Toyota Agility, if he brings out Formula One, I'm going to lose my mind. Almudena Rodriguez Pardo is joining Dev Stage roster. I'll just say what we're all thinking here. Dev Stage is gender equality stage. The topic of discussion is DevOps and people, where automation begins. DevOps. Okay, so now they're just inventing words. On X, we welcome Miloš Zekovic. Again, I'll just say again what we're all thinking. X stage is Serbian stage. You should know right now that this workshop will occupy 2 slots. This and after Miloš has 2 slots with his workshop. And you'll work with him on big product building component of future teams. And right now on Epic, please a round of applause for Jesper Boeg.
Thank you very much. Okay, are you awake? I know I got the grave last shift right after lunch, and I can only assume it's because I'm the most entertaining, so it's more likely that I'll keep you guys awake for the next 45 minutes. But let's see how we do about that. Okay, if I can get this to work. My name is Jesper. I've been working with Agile, Lean, change initiatives, transformations for the past roughly 12 years. Done it in pretty much all the different contexts you can imagine, from small startups just trying to get a product out of the runway before we run out of money, and to trying to help large organizations where the stuff we might be able to change in a couple of days in the startup world could sometimes take weeks or months in the larger organizations. Also wrote a few books at a time, and yeah, if you're interested in those two, you can download them for free at InfoQ. 2 years ago, I embarked on the most agile project I've done so far, traveling the world with my family and 2 kids. And that calls for a lot of adaptations when you're stranded in a small island in Indonesia and 1 kid is sick and you don't know where the hospitals are. And so that's also something to take into consideration. Right now, I'm at a bank central in Denmark called Bankdata, trying to help them roll out the Toyota Kata framework in the entire organization. So that's been very exciting. It's more of a frontier kind of work where nobody's really done this much in an agile setting or in a development context at all. So finding out how we can do systematic continuous improvement outside the manufacturing world. And my guess is that we're just starting to see the real potential of continuous improvement in our own IT world. But that will be something for the future. Okay, so people having worked with me will realize I'm pretty nerdy about this stuff. So no matter if I'm coaching a larger program or a single team, then I like to keep stuff visible. So we know what we're doing and we can track what we're doing. And I do that on a team level, I do that on a portfolio level. I also try to do it for my own work, making sure that I don't overload my own personal agenda with more stuff than I've been able to finish. And then at one point I thought it would be a brilliant idea to bring that concept back home to the family. So making sure that my weekends could not be overloaded with more stuff and good ideas that I could actually complete. And especially the limit on the idea column there, if you can see that. That's a great idea for your better half at home, because then she'll have to make a decision what she needs to pull down to get something new up there. Okay, but let's talk about Agile and upstream. And we see some general problems happening here, and especially in the Scrum world, where it seems that there's this notion of sprint filling out our entire mindset and the way we look at the world. And then that causes some trouble, because then we have our dear professionals in terms of user experience design, or we have some business consultants, and they're part of the team, but they're saying, hey, my work is not part of that sprint, I want my work up there too. So suddenly, instead of delivering value, we'll see weird user stories starting to appear. So suddenly there'll be a user story saying refinement of this issue. And afterwards, we try to demo that to a customer, and they're like, I didn't ask for refinement. I asked for some real IT out there working, making my work easier. Oh yeah, but we just had to put some story points on that, and that made it easier for us to put it all into a sprint context. So that's a big misunderstanding, that we need to put work in there so that we can see what everybody is doing at a point in time. That's not really what the whole thing was meant for. It was meant for tracking the flow of value through our value chain, so we could have some sense of where work stops, where inhibited, where we can't get any further. We also see other problems. I don't know what happened to the slides. They were on my personal computer and worked brilliantly, and now suddenly the design is messed up. But I can't do anything about that now. So we also have we run into what I call the prima donna developers. So they think the whole world was made just so they could have their easy work to perform. So they'll be like, yeah, you know what? If you guys could just for once get your act together and just tell me what to do, then I might be able to finish some work for you on time. I don't really care what it takes from you guys. I don't care if you're going to have to use 10 times more time doing that, but then you can serve me because I am the center of the universe. And then you'll have these overconfident product owners. They'll be like, yeah, I know there are those guys out there serving in the product owner role that don't know what they're doing, but you know what? I used to be the end user of this stuff. I know exactly what we're going to build. So I'm going to get up in my ivory tower. I'm going to pretend that I know exactly what's going on, the exact amount of feedback we're going to get, and how the customers will just love whatever we're trying to build here. So really, there's no need to interact with the world around us. And then we have our brilliant designers in here, and they'll state, yeah, you know what? This is about fulfilling my personal ambition in terms of using every single tool and idea I can come up with, or a design trend that happened in the last 3 years, and that's what I'm going to use all my energy putting into the design. And the actual end users, yeah, they are sort of this annoying thing that we have to pay attention to once in a while. And then we'll have our inside analytics guy asking themselves that question. Okay, so why am I not seeing any engagement? I remember one project where they just went crazy. They spent 3 times more the budget than the customer wanted to pay for, and they made the most beautifully designed IT campaign I've ever seen in my entire life, but the engagement was close to 0. So it looked very pretty on paper, unfortunately not so much of a result. And then we have a tendency to jump to conclusions. And I've seen this happen again and again and again and again. So we find that we have communication problems downstream, either in our development or in our feedback loop or wherever. And we all automatically conclude that those problems are due to us not refining everything up front in enough detail. And what that will turn into over time is us starting to do mini waterfalls and starting to pull in a lot of the old stuff that we were trying to get away from when we were starting to build these agile teams. So we wanted to get away from the strict specifications that nailed everything from solution design to user needs to how the individual boxes should look. And then suddenly we're starting to pull all that information in again, because that way we can avoid any communication happening while we're in our treacherous sprints there. But really, it's just down to communication problems. And if we cannot have a dialogue, if we cannot get on, if we meet problems and we have to solve them, then we'll start to pull in all that upfront specification. And we actually had a single team. They reduced the amount of blocked work during their sprint from 50 to 5%, and they didn't even touch the refinement process. They just worked on their downstream communication problems. Okay. So there are some considerations we need to make when we talk about upstream and downstream and value streams. We actually need to know the flow of value. And if we don't know how value is flowing through our system, then it becomes very, very hard to do process optimization, especially end-to-end process optimization. And if we don't know this, what we'll typically do is that instead we'll start to focus hardcore on what's happening on the development part of our Kanban boards or the sprint in Scrum. But really, it's just hiding the fact that we don't know how work is flowing through our system. So we don't know if our bottlenecks are upstream, if they're in the development phase, or it's in terms of us getting feedback from real customers out there. And that'll generate a whole lot of problems if we try to do real optimization of what we're trying to do, because we'll simply conclude the wrong stuff. So a typical Scrum value stream might look something like this. You've probably seen that before. So we have a backlog. We start to refine some of that stuff. It turns into something that's sprint ready. Pull that into a sprint backlog. We do some development. There's a demo. We put it into a QA environment. Maybe not if we're really mature and we do continuous deployment or continuous delivery, then it's straight to production. But anyway, that's pretty typical. So when I talk about upstream in this context, it's roughly this part. So what's going on here? How can we learn from different schools? How can we learn from the latest trends we've seen develop in our industry over the past 10 years? And all I can say to you, this work becomes endlessly easier for you guys if you start to slice your work vertically. So if you can get away from the notion of designing functional layers and having weird user stories saying, as a front-end developer, I want you as a back-end developer to do this stuff for me. That's not a user story because that's not a real user. That's just another guy on your team, and you made an artificial way of slicing your stuff so that you thought you could pull more story points through your system. That was not the intent when we started this agile transition many years ago. So starting by having the stuff that you visualize on your board being something that's actually interesting from an end user perspective is just core to any kind of optimization that we're doing, especially when we're starting to talk about the upstream part. But then we start to get questions. So how much detail? Should we just write a title on a user story? Is that enough to get started doing some coding and some real work? Should we add anything from solution design into implementation agreements, subtasks? And the answer is, it depends. So there's no fixed description of what definition of ready means in any specific context. But I would just warn you, if your definition of ready starts to look like the stuff we've got here on the left, then your alarm bell should start to go off, because probably you're starting to turn into a mini waterfall organization where you're trying to pull in every single detail and limit all the brain capacity to just doing monkey coding. But then the next question becomes, how far ahead? So how far do we dare plan ahead in an agile context? Do we want all of the details for the next 6 months, down to the very user story detail, trying to get ourselves to believe that that will make us incredibly predictable? Do we want what we see in the Scrum training, where we see this nice shape where it's all detail at the top, and then gradually becomes more and more rough? And again, it depends. I would never create that backlog that you see in the Scrum training sessions if I was in a lean startup kind of context, where you need to get things off just to test whether you're even heading in the right direction. But I would never go there either, because that is again where you start to play agile, because you've got sprints, but in reality, you're just doing your waterfall project in small slices. But there's a Scrum paradox built in here. And that is that we have a tendency, and I've seen this continuously over the last years, that we continue to focus on a very, very limited part of our value stream. And the problem is that as organizations mature, that's not our real bottleneck. So we can probably get to a point for most teams where they're able to do some work, where they're able to deliver it reasonably well, and with enough quality so that you could put it into production. But the problem is that they have no idea what happens once that code goes into production, and the feedback loop is simply missing. Or, as we're going to talk a bit about today, we have no idea how we get to the point where we can actually start working on that stuff. So we're hiding ourselves from dealing with the real complexity by focus solely on what's going on inside our precious sprints. So typically, what I call maturity level 1, visualization would look something like this. So we're visualizing the stuff in the middle here, but whatever goes on before and after, it's kind of hidden. And it might be that actually only a very small part of what's to the right here actually generated some real user value. And it might also be that our real bottlenecks are a totally dysfunctional process going on to the left here, where simply we have no idea how many options we have in play, we have no idea how to refine them to the right level, and we have no idea what flow actually means across this entire value stream. So once we get a bit further, you'll start to see visualizations looking more something like this. So that's where we start to see more of an end-to-end visualization of work. That's what we call real transparency, because now we start to include. And we also, by doing this, we get less of that discussion in terms of where does my work fit? Because naturally, if you're a UX designer or you're a business consultant, then some part of your work is going to go on outside your sprints. And it might even be that if you're not in a very mature team where you can all work in parallel with all the skills, then maybe even 70% of your work is going to go on before it hits the sprint context. But now it's visual, so now we stop those fights about where does my work fit into the Scrum board. I'm not going to actually make you repeat this after me, don't worry. But it's a tendency that I'm seeing again and again, and no matter the organization size, no matter if it's a startup, if it's a large organization, if it's relatively young people or older people, they get this principle of flow wrong. So they think of flow as something that minimizes communication during, for example, their sprints. It's not about that. When we talk about flow and we talk about refinement and we talk about upstream work, we talk about getting the decisions in place so that work can flow through our system. So it does mean that we need all our decisions to be in place, but we need just enough of our decisions to be made up front so that we have, for a reasonable amount of our work, at least an assumption that from now on we can work effectively. We can deal with problems, we can communicate with the world, but we can find ways of solving those problems as we go along. Because we all know that it's very expensive when we get to the point where things were not made ready enough. Because that's where we see a team, they're starting a user story, then they run into some problems, it's put on the shelf. 2 days after, they get the feedback they need to go on, but they're already working on something else, then they have to go back, it's task switching, then that's stopped again, that's blocked, and suddenly we have 10 items that are in somewhere between started and very close to being finished, and that's a problem. So I'm working with the concept of being ready to flow instead of a definition of ready. So our definition of ready should make work ready to flow. It shouldn't be the fact that we don't have to communicate or solve problems or run into issues, but we should have the assumption that at least for 80% of that work going on, it should be able to continue from there. Okay, so I'd like you guys to spend the next 3-4 minutes discussing with the person next to you. So what happens upstream in your organization? What problems do you see? What works well? What doesn't work so well? So, get talking. Okay, so let's move on. Can I ask you to raise your hand if you were trying to speak to the person next to you, but he or she was sleeping? Okay, so good. Nobody's sleeping yet, at least from what I can see. I can't ask the sleeping ones though. So, okay, so let's look a bit at the context of evaluating how we're doing in the upstream work. It actually matters. So sometimes you see these ridiculous discussions between a guy that's in a startup and another guy that's working on a system, and they've been working on the same system for 20 years, and they're just extending it with small features. And they get into this heated discussion in terms of whether they're doing refinement or they're testing hypothesis. But they can't have a discussion based on the same context because they're in very, very different worlds. And it matters a lot in terms of the energy and how you approach your upstream process, whether you are in a startup world, where basically you have no idea what it takes to get some real value out of what you're doing, and you really just need to test your basic hypothesis, because it's a new product. You don't know how your user's going to interact. But if you've been working with the same system for the past 20 years, you're probably pretty certain in terms of what those users are asking for, because you just spoke to him yesterday and he's using your features on a daily basis. So context matters a lot when we talk about how we do in the upstream. So such a board that I've showed you before can be pretty simple. So this would probably be adequate for a team that knows reasonably well what product they're building. If it's something they've built features for before, and they know that users are going to be happy because they just asked for the stuff. And it can be a bit more complex. So if we're in a startup context, then we might want to call them not features or user story, but we might just call them options. Because what we're really trying to explore in the upstream work is, should we build this at all? And that's where we do design studios. That's where we do prototypes. That's where we take something that might look like real stuff from an end user perspective, but we just throw it at them to see how they would do. And if they don't like it at all, it's not a big problem because we just spent a few minutes or a few hours building it. And it's not a problem either if it gets discarded, because it was really just trying to test some initial assumptions about how users would like to use our software. So context matters, and you cannot ignore context. Flow also matters in the upstream. So even though you're working in a startup context, you don't want to spend endless time evaluating all the options in the entire world. So also there you want to limit your amount of WIP, work in progress, so you can actually focus on testing basic assumptions. And you want to get that feedback early enough to not start 10 new items before you've actually included the actual feedback from doing that process. So flow also matters in the upstream, but we're careful in defining, as Carl mentioned earlier, a failure as a big problem. Because failing here just meant probably that we bought information cheaply. So as Carl said, if you're testing something where in the unknown context and you're failing, then that might have been the best way to buy new knowledge. So the fact that it goes in the discarded item here, in the bucket here, it's not a problem because we learned something, and that was the whole purpose of our exercise. So let's talk a bit about options and commitment points. So maybe you've seen this case before in your own world. It's called commitment point asymmetry. So this is where the developer thought that things were committed. So this is where we went from having it as a good idea or an option we could do or not do, and to something we actually decided to work on. But the problem was that they also had a stakeholder, and they thought the commitment was here. So that's where they thought that somebody told them that this work is actually going to be done. It's no longer just an option, it's committed stuff that we're actually going to work on. The product owner thought that he communicated that it was around starting refinement. Yeah, so now we're starting to put some real energy into that. That makes it possible that we're actually going to finish it. He or she might even be certain that we're going to finish it. But the problem is that if the development team looks at it from a very different perspective, then suddenly we're starting to get some really weird arguments. And we might even have stakeholders that just presented with the very concept of a product backlog. They thought, this is the amount of committed scope, so I'm actually going to be, you are absolutely sure that I'm going to get this in the next half year. And again, that person will be incredibly disappointed if the true commitment point is more where the developer thought it was. So aligning just the communication around when do we move from having an option, something we might do based on the initial feedback, and to something that's actually committed. Important discussion, because obviously we don't always agree. I don't know if you're aware of it, but science has shown that if during this presentation I'll show you a picture of a cute animal, then you will rate my presentation exactly 15% better. So I'd just like to say thank you, and then we can move on, because the slide is up there and you've all had a chance to look at it. Okay. So, upstream and predictability. It's not easy. And it never was easy. But unfortunately, you'll find trainers out there giving you a version of how the world functions that's simply not adequate in terms of what actually goes on. And that's where you'll get somebody in a Scrum training course telling you, yeah, you know what? If you measure velocity, that's going to solve all your problems in the entire world. So instead of just guessing, now you've got data. And data is good because then we know yesterday's weather and we can plan with yesterday's weather. And then you can just tell your customers, yeah, if we continue along this line of prioritization, then you'll get your backlog item in 2.5 months and 3 hours. But the problem is measuring velocity at this point in your value stream does not in any way guarantee that you'll be predictable looking a bit forward. Because those items are different. Those items might have been broken down a few times into something that's very different. Those might be estimated using very different techniques. I've even seen velocity measured at the task level. And then that task level velocity was automatically transferred to predictability on a combination of user stories and epics in a backlog. you can't do that unless you think really very critically about how you want to support that structure. And it's beyond the scope of this presentation to go into the details, but it's anything from randomized branch sampling to relative epic estimates to trying to break things down to a user story level. And there are a number of techniques, but if you want that predictability, you're going to pay for it. It's not cheap, and it's going to buy, and you have to have a lot of discipline to support it going forward. So if somebody's asking you for a predictability that goes beyond the individual sprints, then you have to think really careful about it, because it's not free. And you have to put in some discipline and effort to get to the point where you can actually use it. It's not impossible either, but it's nothing you just get by doing your standard relative story point estimates at your sprint planning meeting, and then by magic something happens to the structure and the chaos of breaking things down, and you just arrived at something you want. Another good question to ask yourself is predictability on what? So we're from early school, we're groomed into thinking that predictability involves the traditional stuff that we've been learning in business school. So it's about being able to meet the amount of scope and the desired time, and maybe even also on the budget. But what if your real risk is not generating the right value? Then that might be the real issue you're trying to deal with here. That might be the real predictability that you want, and that's where you might want to use some lean startup concepts or similar stuff. But it could also be that it's actually from an economic perspective. But that means that you have to approach it differently compared to if the deadline is the most important thing in the entire world. So don't assume that you all agree on what predictability means. Anybody read the Lean Startup book? Have you? Okay, so that book taught us a lot of things. But I think that as a community we agree that one of the most important and crucial learnings from the Lean Startup movement was our basic assumption in the Agile community that we needed to build a lot of stuff. That we haven't proven anything before we've built the entire stack of work. So if we couldn't see it in real functioning code, somehow it wasn't really valuable. And the Lean Startup movement taught us that, you know what, if your real risk is not knowing what real users want, then you want to get to a point as soon as possible where you can show something to those users. They'll assume it's a real solution. But the fact that you have a string of manual procedures behind it doesn't really matter, because you're just testing the basic assumption. And I don't know if you remember the story about the guy that wanted to find out whether people wanted to buy shoes online. And nobody had done that before. But instead of building the entire product and having agreements with several sub-suppliers of shoes, he just went to his local shoe shop and said, you know what, can I put your product catalog online? And that guy said, yeah, maybe. Okay, but I promise you, if I'll sell just one of that stuff from that product catalog, I'll go down to your shop, I'll buy it at full price, and I'll send it to my customer. He's like, what are you getting out of it? I'm testing an assumption. I'm just testing the assumption, do people want to buy shoes online? I'm not trying to build the entire stack, because I'm certain that if we want to do that, we can do that. Sorry. Another point is that we talk about this minimum viable product concept as if it was not context related. And you might have seen slides like this stating that that's not a minimum viable product because you can't really get anything that works from the first line there. But you might also have seen a slide that says the next one is a really good minimum viable product because that's testing an assumption as early as possible. And then you'll have another guy telling you that the only minimum viable product in here is actually the bottom line here. And you know what? Both of those could be excellent minimum viable products. If you want to test the assumption of people wanting to go from A to B faster than walking, building the first version here would be excellent because you're just testing that assumption. If you already know that those people want to go from A to B and they have to be 4 people in using that kind of transportation, and by the way, they want a car, then that version might be the most excellent minimum viable product you could build for them. But it's context specific. It's based, what assumption are you trying to validate? And if you already know they want a car with 4 wheels and there have to be 5 people in there, then don't start building a bicycle because it's never going to support it. But if you don't know whether they want to get faster from A to B, then that could be an excellent minimal viable product. How many of you are familiar with the no estimates movement? A few. So what those guys said was that you got it all wrong. So you want predictability. But really, our data from huge software projects shows the best thing you can do is just count the number of items. So you don't really even have to estimate, because the data will tell you, and it might be that one item is 50 times bigger than another item, but over time, those things will even themselves out. And I'm not sure. My own data tells me that it's not true, that simply just by doing a project, we start out with larger stuff and then it gets gradually smaller and smaller, so we're less predictable if we just count the number of items. But I think one key thing it taught us was that just by endlessly refining stuff in our upstream part of the process, it is not necessarily going to make us more predictable. What actually happens is that we get these distributions looking something like this. And as you can see, we're pretty certain in this space here. That's where we know roughly what's going on, but sometimes we get it really wrong. So we thought this was a small, but it ends up taking longer than our average medium. We thought it was a medium, but it ends up taking longer than our average large. And you know what? We can't solve that problem because we're doing development. And that's where we run into the unknown unknowns. And no matter how much planning you do up front, you're never going to solve that tail. That tail on your estimate distribution, it's going to be there forever. Sorry, guys. But when you start to put hours and hours and hours into estimation sessions, what you're doing is that you're making it a bit more certain, but it's in the part where you're already quite certain. So it's not going to help you solve your predictability problems. So get to the point where you've done enough, where you have some overview of what's going on, and then do some rough estimates. That's what the data tells us. We cannot, by endlessly refining, subtasking, doing detailed estimates, we cannot get any closer to any overview of how much work we can do in a certain amount of time or money. How many are familiar with the Lean UX movement? Try to read that book. It's actually pretty good. They also told us something about the upstream. It was UX guys telling us that we needed to include the entire team in trying to come up with great ideas to solve complex products. And I must admit, I was a bit skeptic. So we would have this brilliant UX designer on our team, and then suddenly that guy was asking me to sit there and do wireframes. And you know what? From one of those design studios where we sat together for an entire team, just spending 15 minutes coming up with different approaches, one of my ideas made it into real code, that made it into real production. And it's not that I'm ever going to be a great designer, and it's not that I could do the whole stuff with completing the wireframes and finding out the workflows. But you know what? When you start to pull from the creativity of an entire team, something crazy happens. And you find out that sometimes it's the back-end developer that typically comes up with the best idea in terms of framing the overall concept. And then it takes all of the expertise of the UX designer to make it into something that's good enough. And the back-end developer never could have done that. But creativity belongs to all of us. Lean UX also told us that with all the development and technology, we can do amazing prototypes in almost no time. So again, if we, listening to Carl, know that we're going to fail if we're doing something new, then why not make it as cheap and safe to fail as possible? And it's amazing what some of those guys can do in 15 minutes just building a rough prototype. And the biggest problem with that is that then you show it to some real users. And they'll say, oh my God, that's fantastic. I want something like that. And they're playing around with it. But then we have to tell them, but it's not working. And they'll be, oh yeah, it's working. Just give me one of those. I want it in production tomorrow. Yeah, but it's not working. It's fake. It's static. It would never scale on a mobile device. All sorts of problems. But what they're seeing is looking so close to something that's actually usable that it becomes hard to distinguish. But we can test something very, very cheaply. And that means that suddenly the whole safe to fail concept becomes much, much easier. Because spending 15 minutes, failing, having to redo the whole stuff, compared to having implemented the entire stack, it's very, very different. It's much, much more expensive once you've done the traditional agile stuff. And maybe you sliced it thin, but you still built all the layers in there. Okay. And then there's the planning stuff, and we already touched a bit upon that. So typically, you'll have managers senior leaders, asking you, how far can we plan ahead? But that's a very stupid question to ask. The right question to ask, how far dare we plan ahead? So we've seen a number of slides, probably also on other conferences, stating how quickly the world changes and how it just keeps accelerating. So how far dare we plan ahead when we know that the whole world around us is going to change? Do we dare plan 6 months ahead in a context where we can barely be static for 2 months before a new competitor launches some product we hadn't seen before we get new knowledge about our users and what they really like, before the economic situation changes or whatever happens? So instead of asking yourself how far can we plan ahead, because that's far, then start asking yourself how far dare we plan ahead. And then we can use nice techniques like story mapping, stuff like that, to get to the point where we really slice that very, very thin. How many are familiar with the work of Black Swans and Nassim Taleb? He makes some excellent points, and he's very nerdy in his fields, and you have to be a really hardcore mathematician or engineer for really to understand the calculations behind his frameworks and methods. But the one thing I think we could learn a lot from is that we spend so much time trying to optimize for being predictable. And we spend time estimating, and we start maybe we're so good that we're starting even to do Monte Carlo-based probabilistic forecastings on our excellent velocity data. And we spend so much time trying to be predictable that we actually ignore that sometimes it's much, much easier and better to try to reduce the cost of failure. And I had a very good example, and I fell right into that trap myself. So we're doing a huge program, 10 teams building the same product. We needed them to meet at the same time for this product to launch. And we spent so much time trying to get the whole structure in place so we could actually do the predictability stuff and have the epics included and forecast and those two, that we simply forgot for a period of almost 2 months. So what if we changed the strategy? What if we made it cheaper for this team to fail? Because we're never going to end up at a place in time where all 10 teams are going to finish at the same time anyway. So what if we change the priority of an individual team? Could we then reduce the consequence of that team falling behind the others and not meeting this shared deadline? And the answer was, we could very, very cheaply do that. But for 2 months, it did not even occur to us to have that discussion. So try to plan as much for reducing the cost of failure as just planning for reducing failure. It's sometimes much, much cheaper than you think. And we also see that in marketing. So the marketing team will tell you, yeah, we need to know the entire amount of features going into this release, otherwise we can't launch this $20 million marketing campaign. And you know what? Yes, you can. Because you have to tell us what are the absolute critical amount of stuff that needs to go into that marketing. And then we can optimize for making sure that we've got at least some of that covered. And then there are other stuff that are less important from your perspective. And then suddenly the cost of failure is much less because we've told the marketing team, don't include the entire full scope. Only include the core message and do your marketing campaign around that instead. Okay, so we've got 5 minutes left. Any great questions? Okay, any questions? Yep. Sorry? I'll repeat the question. Okay, you can.
Okay, let me go. Okay, so the slide where you were presenting the definition of ready, there were several items there, and you mentioned that amount of items would be a waterfall approach. So, in your opinion, what would be the right amount of things to put in a definition of ready list?
Yeah. So I wish I could just give you an answer stating you need to include these 6 items and then you'll all be good to go. But the problem is it is really context dependent. I can tell you about what I wouldn't include in the definition of ready. Detailed solution design would, in my world, rarely go into a definition of ready. I wouldn't include specific graphical details in terms of the actual design. I would keep it on a higher level to make sure that we can actually still adapt and iterate into that stuff. Because otherwise we'll fall into the trap of having it design complete and UX complete before we even start the work. But I'm sorry guys, the true answer is it really depends. And that's also why you can't find a standard definition of ready in the Scrum guide. But try to think of it as this concept of being ready to flow. Not ready so that you don't have to communicate, but ready so that you think you've at least pulled in the major things that could ultimately result in work stopping for longer periods of time once you start developing. Great. There are other hands up? Yes, so behind there. Deadlines. Yeah, so that's a very good question. And as I mentioned before, yes, we can do the stuff where we actually turn velocity on a sprint level or just a weekly data if we're using Kanban and don't work with sprints. And we can use that to more accurately predict where we want to go. But we have to pay attention to this breakdown structure that's going to happen no matter what. And one of the solutions could be that we use relative epic estimates that are then replaced by the children once we get to the user story level. Another could be random and branch sampling. But common for those approaches is that if you want to use data, I would strongly recommend not to have only your averages, because averages can be seriously misleading. And if you use averages to predict a deadline from your data, then there's as big a chance of you not meeting that deadline as there is meeting that deadline. And it's weird, but we see that mistake made again and again. So what you want to do is that, as a bare minimum, you want to use some kind of probabilistic forecasting, where you say, okay, what kind of accuracy do you want my answer with? Do you want 90% accuracy? Then I'm going to give you one possible deadline. If you want just 20%, meaning that it's going to fail 4 out of 5 times, then I'm going to give you another deadline. And if you're talking about deadlines in the sense that they've already been communicated, well, then it's basically a flexible scope question. So all you can do then, if we acknowledge that adding more people is a strategic initiative and not something that's going to change anything on the short term, it might change something, but for the worse, then what you really only can do is that you have to be very, very hardcore in terms of managing scope and cutting out every single piece that isn't necessary, because that deadline will also have uncertainty. Meaning that if you plan for 100% of your scope and an average velocity, then again there is probably even bigger than half the chance of failing, because not only do you have the uncertainty in terms of the amount of work you can do, but you also probably have the uncertainty in terms of, do you actually know how much work you don't know you have to do before you're finished? So there are definitely different strategies to handling deadlines. Okay, other questions, sorry. Yes, in the middle. You made it a bit difficult for the guys with the microphones, but I'm sure that's cool. Yes? So actually, and it was meant to provoke you guys a bit, that slide. Actually, when we're dealing with prima donna developers, it's often the consequence of managers that are not communicating adequately about how we want work to be done. So if you're strictly punished, if you're kept to your sprint commitments, if people pay a lot of attention in terms of whether you make your deadlines either short or long term, then you're going to get into a not so nice dialogue about how can we make even more certain that this is going to happen. So most often, actually prima donna developers are the consequence of organizational structures around those people that made them into that kind of person. So it's really not their fault. Of course, sometimes we get people that no matter the organizational structure, no matter how perfectly it's set up, they're still going to have that very narrow mindset of me, 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 me. And those do actually fall into the prima donna category. But for the majority part, for 90% of those guys that fall into this trap, it's actually because of the organizational structure and the leadership around them and not the person. I don't know how we are in terms of time. Oh, we're 13 seconds from finishing. So that was it. Thank you very much, guys. I don't know how, but I'm sure you're going to get access to the slides afterwards. I'll send it to Puzzle Software. And in the slides, you can also see some key takeaways. I'm not going to list them once again. And if you want to contact me, feel free to call or write. I'm available. And if you ask too many questions, then I'll just ask you to stop. But better that than not trying. Okay, so thank you very much.